A 6-year-old boy standing in a midnight storm with his little sister on his hip, pounding his fist bloody against a stranger's door. Not because he had anywhere to go, but because staying meant dying. Clara Winslow opened that door with a lantern in one hand and a musket she barely knew how to fire in the other. By morning, armed men on horseback would demand she hand those children over. She would refuse, and that refusal would cost her everything she had spent 10 years building, and give her something she had never thought to want. If this story moves you, hit that like button right now and drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments. I want to see just how far this story has traveled. Stay with me until the very end. The storm had been building since late afternoon, the kind that rolled in off the open plains without much warning and settled over everything like it meant to stay. Clara Winslow had watched it coming from her classroom window, the sky going from pale gray to a bruised, yellowing green, and had dismissed her 3 students early, telling them to go straight home and not dawdle. She'd ridden back to her cabin herself, gotten her horse into the lean-to, and spent the next 2 hours nailing a loose board back onto the south-facing shutter before the wind made it impossible. By 10 o'clock, she had given up on sleep. The storm was too loud for it, and the cabin was too small to pretend the noise wasn't there. She sat at her table with a cup of tea gone cold and a letter she'd been trying to write to her sister in Cincinnati for 3 weeks, and she stared at the first line. "Dear Margaret, I hope this finds you well," and couldn't think of a single thing to add. She was 31 years old. She had been teaching in Harrows Creek, Indiana for 4 years, which meant she had outlasted 2 other school teachers and a preacher who'd decided frontier life wasn't for him. She lived alone by choice, or at least she had told herself it was by choice often enough that she'd mostly stopped questioning it. Her cabin sat at the edge of the settlement, close enough to the schoolhouse that she could walk it in 10 minutes on a dry day, far enough from the nearest neighbor that she couldn't see their chimney smoke from her porch. She heard the knocking at 10:30. Her first thought was that a branch had come loose. The wind was doing strange things to sound that night, pushing it sideways and muffling it, and then throwing it at the walls all at once. She waited. The knocking came again, 3 hard raps, then a pause, then 3 more. Clara stood from the table and picked up the lantern. She did not pick up the musket yet. That came after she looked through the gap in the shutter and saw the shape of a child, small, hunched against the rain, one arm raised to knock again, and then saw the smaller shape he was carrying pressed against his chest. She got the musket then. Not because she thought a child was dangerous, because a child alone in a midnight storm meant something else was out there in the dark, and she had lived long enough on the frontier to know that whatever had sent those children running was probably worse than the storm. She opened the door. The boy was maybe 6 years old, though the rain and the mud and the desperate set of his jaw made him look older in some ways and terrifyingly young in others. His clothes were wrong for this. Good wool, a proper coat with brass buttons, shoes that had been expensive before the mud got to them. His hair was plastered flat against his forehead. He was shaking, but his eyes were steady in a way that unsettled her. In his arms he held a girl, younger, 4 years old at most, her face pressed into his neck, her fingers gripping his lapel so tightly her knuckles had gone white. "Please," the boy said. His voice didn't waver. "Please let us in. She won't make a sound, I promise. She doesn't talk." Clara looked past them into the dark. Rain and wind and the distant crack of a branch somewhere in the tree line. Nothing moving that she could see. "Who are you?" she said. "My name's Ethan. This is Lydia." He shifted the girl's weight. "We can't go back. Please." Clara stepped back and opened the door wider. She got them inside and got the door latched and spent the next several minutes just trying to deal with the immediate problem, which was that they were soaked through and shaking, and the little girl, Lydia, hadn't lifted her face from her brother's neck the entire time. Clara pulled the quilt from her bed and wrapped it around both of them together, because Ethan would not put his sister down, and she didn't think it was worth fighting him on it. She moved the kettle over the fire and found the end of a loaf of bread she'd baked 2 days ago and cut it into slices. Ethan watched her do all of this with the focused attention of someone cataloging an escape route. "Eat," she said, setting the bread in front of him. "Lydia first." "Lydia can eat too. There's plenty." He looked at the bread. Something shifted in his face. Just for a moment, the careful control slipping, and she saw how hungry he was. He broke a piece off and held it to his sister's lips, murmuring something Clara couldn't hear. And after a moment, Lydia opened her mouth and took it. Then Ethan ate. Clara sat across from them and kept her voice even. "Where did you come from?" "The Mercer house." He said it without hesitation, which surprised her. "It's about 4 miles east, past the creek." She knew the Mercer property. Everyone in Harrow's Creek knew it. Caleb Mercer owned most of the land between the settlement and the river, ran cattle and a modest timber operation, and was largely absent, managing holdings elsewhere, or so the story went. She had seen him maybe twice in 4 years, a tall, quiet man who didn't linger in town. What she knew about his household, she knew secondhand, that he was the ward guardian to his late brother's children, and that his aunt ran the house in his absence. "Your guardian is Caleb Mercer?" she said. "Yes, ma'am." "And his aunt, Eleanor Mercer, she's at the house?" Ethan's jaw tightened. He broke off another piece of bread and didn't answer. Clara waited. "She was at the house," he said finally. "She's always at the house. Uncle Caleb isn't." "Why did you run?" The boy looked at his sister. Lydia had turned her face slightly away from his neck now, enough that Clara could see one eye, watching. Dark eyes. Still. "She was going to lock Lydia in the cellar again," Ethan said. "She does it when Uncle Caleb's away. She says Lydia is slow and needs to learn to behave. But Lydia isn't slow." His voice cracked on the last word, just barely. "She's just scared. She stopped talking because she's scared." Clara felt something settle cold and specific in her chest. She had been a teacher long enough to know the difference between a child repeating something they'd been coached to say and a child reporting something that happened. This was the second thing. "How long has Lydia not been talking?" she asked. "Since winter," he swallowed. "Mrs. Eleanor did something. I didn't see it. I heard it. And then Lydia didn't talk anymore." The fire popped. Outside, the storm hit the cabin with a sound like a fist. "All right," Clara said. "You're staying here tonight. We'll figure out the rest in the morning." She meant it as a comfort. She did not yet understand that the rest would not wait for morning. She gave them her bed. She told Ethan she would be on the floor by the fire, and he looked at her like he was trying to decide if she was trustworthy, and she looked back at him and let him decide. Eventually he nodded and carried Lydia to the bed and laid her down and climbed in beside her, still in his damp clothes because Clara hadn't been able to convince him to change into anything she owned, which would have been comically large. She'd gotten them out of their wet coats at least, and the cabin was warm. She sat in her chair by the fire, with the musket across her knees, and the lantern turned low, and thought about what she had just agreed to. A frontier schoolteacher, unmarried, with no family within 300 miles, had just given shelter to 2 children who had run away from their legal guardian's household. If Eleanor Mercer chose to make trouble, and from everything Ethan had said, Eleanor Mercer was precisely the kind of woman who chose to make trouble, Clara could lose her teaching position. She could be legally charged with something, though she wasn't sure what. The law in Harrow's Creek was a county sheriff who rode through every 6 weeks, and a justice of the peace, who was also the postmaster and who Clara had never once seen make a decision that cost him anything personally. She was still working through the shape of it when she heard the horses. She heard them before she saw anything. The particular sound of multiple riders moving fast in wet weather, the way hooves in mud have a different rhythm than hooves on dry ground. She got to the window and looked out through the shutter gap and counted 3 lanterns, which meant at least 3 riders and possibly more in the dark behind them. They pulled up in front of her cabin like they'd known exactly where to come. Clara looked back at the bed. Ethan was sitting up, fully awake, with Lydia pressed behind him. He had heard them too. "Stay there," Clara said. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. "Don't make a sound." "Are they going to take us?" "Not if I can help it." She picked up the musket. "Stay behind the bed frame. Keep Lydia down." She went to the door. She heard one of them dismount, heard boots on the wet ground, and then a fist against the door. Not a knock exactly, more like an announcement. "Miss Winslow." A man's voice, controlled, accustomed to being listened to. "I know you're awake. There's light under your door. I need to speak with you." Clara lifted the latch and opened the door 6 inches, keeping the musket at her side but not hidden. There were 4 of them. 3 were hired men. She could tell from the way they sat their horses, the particular loose readiness of people paid to wait. The 4th was the one who had dismounted. He was taller than she remembered, and older looking than the man she'd seen at a distance in town, though she couldn't have said exactly what had aged him. He was hatless, his dark coat soaked through, his boots caked to the knee with creek mud. He looked like a man who had been riding hard for hours. "Caleb Mercer," he said. It wasn't a question. "I know who you are," Clara said. "Then you know I have legal guardianship over my brother's children." He looked at her directly, not past her. "Are they here?" "What I know about who's in my cabin," Clara said, "is my business." One of the riders shifted his horse. Clara raised the musket. "Tell your men to stay where they are," she said. Mercer looked at the musket. He looked at her. He raised one hand, not toward her, out to the side, and the rider stilled. "I'm not here to take them by force," he said. "That's a considerable number of horses for a man who isn't here to take them by force. I've been riding in circles for 6 hours in a thunderstorm. I brought men because I didn't know what I'd find." Something moved across his face. Frustration, or something older than that. "Miss Winslow, I have been out of the territory for 2 weeks. I came home tonight and found—" He stopped, pressed his mouth together, started again. "I found the cellar locked, and marks on the floor where someone had been sitting for a long time, and I could not find those children, and I have been riding since midnight." Clara watched him. His jaw was tight, and his hands were at his sides, and he was not performing any of this. That was the thing that made her pause. She had watched men perform concern before. The sheriff, the postmaster, a father who'd come to her once about his son, and spent the whole conversation talking about how it reflected on himself. This man looked like someone in the specific, ugly grip of guilt that has not yet become grief because it's too afraid to. "Why was the cellar locked?" she said. He met her eyes. "My aunt locked it." "And you knew she did that?" A long pause. The rain came down between them. "I didn't know the specifics," he said. "I knew she had methods, ways of disciplining the children that I didn't." He stopped again. "I told myself it wasn't as bad as it seemed. I was wrong. I know I was wrong. I've known it for longer than I've let myself admit." Clara looked at him for another long moment. Then she said, "Ethan?" A silence from inside the cabin. Then, "Yes, ma'am." "Come look." Another pause. Then she heard the boy's careful footsteps on the floor and felt him at her back. She didn't move aside. She just gave him room to see past her arm. Mercer looked down at the boy. His face did something complicated. "Ethan," he said. His voice had changed, not softer exactly, but different, like he'd stopped being careful about what it showed. Ethan stared at him. "You came back," the boy said. "I came back." "She said you wouldn't. She said you were too busy." Mercer crouched down in the mud and rain without hesitating, which put him at eye level with the boy, and Clara watched his face and kept her hand on the musket. "I came back," he said again. "I'm sorry it took me this long." Ethan looked at him for a long time. Then he looked up at Clara. "He's not like her," he said. He's not like her." But he let it happen. "I know," Clara said. She looked back at Mercer. He was still crouched in the mud, and he did not look away from her. And she had the peculiar sensation of watching a man make some kind of accounting in real time. "You can't take them back there," she said. "Not while she's in that house." "I know that too." "Then what are you proposing?" He stood up, mud on his knees, rain on his face. He looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the night's riding. "I'm proposing that you keep them until morning," he said, "and that in the morning we figure out how to fix what I should have fixed a long time ago." She did not trust him. She wanted to be clear with herself about that. Trusting a man because he looked guilty in the rain was not a strategy, and she had not survived 4 years on the frontier by mistaking performance for substance. But she also understood that sending him away changed nothing about the situation except who was standing in the mud. She told him to send his men back to the property. She told him he could shelter in her lean-to, which was large enough for a man and a horse, until morning. She told him that if she heard so much as a boot on her porch without an invitation, she would fire first and ask questions afterward. He agreed to all of it without argument, which she found either encouraging or suspicious, and couldn't quite decide which. She went back inside and latched the door and put another log on the fire and looked at the two children in her bed. Lydia had moved. She was sitting up now, her dark eyes visible over the edge of the quilt, watching the door. She had seen Mercer. She had heard his voice. She had not spoken, but she hadn't looked afraid either. More like she was doing the same kind of accounting her brother had done, weighing something. Ethan was beside her, his hand over hers on top of the quilt. "Is he going to make us go back?" Ethan asked. "Not tonight," Clara said. "Tonight you stay here. What about tomorrow?" She sat in her chair and picked up her cold tea and looked at the fire. "Tomorrow, we're going to make sure you don't have to go anywhere you're not safe." She said it with more certainty than she had, but she had learned over 4 years of teaching children who were scared of things they couldn't name that certainty from an adult, even borrowed certainty, even uncertain certainty, was sometimes the only thing that let a frightened child close their eyes. Lydia looked at her for a long moment. Then she lay back down and pulled the quilt up and tucked herself against her brother's side, and Ethan put his arm around her, and within 20 minutes they were both asleep. Clara sat with the musket across her knees and watched the fire burn down, and thought about what she had just walked into. She thought about Eleanor Mercer, whom she had never met, but whom she was already building a shape of in her mind from the evidence in front of her. A locked cellar, a little girl who had stopped speaking, a boy who at 6 years old had learned to read every room he entered like a map of potential threats. She thought about Caleb Mercer out in her lean-to in the mud, and about the difference between a man who had done wrong and a man who had done wrong and knew it. She thought about her sister in Cincinnati and the letter she'd been failing to write for 3 weeks, and about how she'd spent the last 4 years telling herself that a life alone was a life she'd chosen, and about how sometimes the things you tell yourself longest are the things most worth questioning. The storm eased sometime before 4 in the morning. She heard it go out of the wind, the rain dropping from a roar to a steady tap, and then to silence. In the quiet, she could hear the children breathing. She kept watch until dawn. Dawn came in flat and gray, the kind of morning that follows a bad storm and doesn't bother pretending to be cheerful about it. The trees were still dripping. The ground between Clara's cabin and the lean-to had turned to a slick reddish mud that held boot prints like a mold, and the air smelled of wet bark and something faintly electric, the way it does after lightning has been close. Clara had not slept. She'd dozed once, maybe an hour before first light, sitting in her chair with her chin dropping toward her chest, and she jerked awake at the sound of Lydia turning over in the bed, and spent the next 20 minutes convincing herself she hadn't missed anything important. By the time the light came through the shutter gaps, she had given up on sleep entirely and put the kettle on and stood at the window watching the lean-to. Mercer came out of it just after sunrise. He'd taken his coat off at some point and hung it over the rail to dry, and his shirt was wrinkled and his hair was a mess, and he moved like a man whose back had spent the night against a wall. He stood in the thin morning light for a moment, looking at the sky, and then he looked at the cabin. Clara stepped back from the window before he could see her watching. She heard him knock a few minutes later, not the way he'd knocked the night before. That had been the knock of a man accustomed to doors opening when he arrived. This was quieter, almost tentative. She opened the door. "Coffee?" she said, because it was the safest thing to say. "Yes," he said. "Thank you." She left the door open and went back to the fire, and after a moment she heard him come inside and close it carefully behind him, the way you do when there are sleeping children in the house. He sat at the table without being invited, which she registered but let go, and she poured 2 cups and set one in front of him and sat across from him with the other. For a moment neither of them said anything. The fire ticked. From the bed came the slow, even breathing of 2 children still asleep. "How old are you?" Clara asked. It came out before she'd decided to say it. Mercer looked up. 34. "And your brother?" "Ethan and Lydia's father. He died when?" 3 years ago. Fever. His wife had already been gone 2 years before that. He wrapped both hands around the cup. "There was no one else. Our parents are both dead. Eleanor is my father's sister. She'd been managing the household since before I inherited the property." "So you kept her on?" "I kept her on. Because it was convenient." He didn't flinch from it. "Because it was convenient. Because I didn't want to deal with finding someone else. Because she'd always kept the house in order and I didn't ask what order cost. He looked at the coffee. Those are all true. I've been trying to decide which one is the real reason, and I think they all are. Clara drank her coffee and looked at him. What did you find when you got home last night? You said the cellar was locked. Padlocked from the outside. There was a blanket on the floor and a bucket in the corner. His voice stayed level, but something around his eyes tightened. Eleanor was asleep upstairs. When I woke her, she told me Ethan had run off with Lydia, that he'd always been a difficult child, that she'd been trying to teach Lydia discipline and he'd interfered. He paused. She said it the way you'd say a child tracked mud on the floor. Just matter of fact, irritated. And that's when you went looking. I didn't even finish listening to her. He set the cup down. I just went. Clara thought about the marks on the floor he'd mentioned, where someone had been sitting for a long time. She didn't ask him to describe them again. She didn't need to. Ethan told me last night that Lydia stopped speaking in winter, she said. He said Eleanor did something. He didn't see it, but he heard it. Mercer was quiet for a moment. I knew Lydia had gone quiet. Eleanor told me it was a phase, that some children did it, that she'd grow out of it. His jaw was tight. I knew something was wrong. I didn't push hard enough to know what. No, Clara said. You didn't. He looked at her. She held his gaze and didn't apologize for saying it. I know, he said. From across the room there was a rustling. They both turned. Ethan was awake, sitting up in the bed with his hair standing at odd angles, looking at Mercer with an expression that was hard to read. Not hostile exactly, but not open either. Careful. The expression of someone who has learned that things change and has stopped assuming they change for the better. You're still here, Ethan said. I'm still here, Mercer said. Are you going to take us back to that house? Mercer looked at the boy for a moment. Then he said, Not while Eleanor's in it. She's always in it. She won't be. Ethan studied him. How? And that, Clara thought, was the right question. The question of a child who had stopped accepting assurances and started asking for plans. She felt a complicated sort of respect for the boy, and a complicated sort of sorrow, because 6-year-olds should not have to ask how. They should be able to take a grown man at his word and go back to sleep. That's what Miss Winslow and I are going to figure out, Mercer said. Ethan looked at her. We'll figure it out, she said. The boy lay back down. After a minute, carefully, he pulled the quilt back up over Lydia's shoulder. His sister slept on. Mercer stayed at the table while Clara fed the children breakfast. More bread, some salt pork she fried in a pan, the last of the dried apples she'd been saving. Lydia ate without looking at anyone, her focus entirely on the food, which Clara recognized as the eating of someone who had learned that meals were not guaranteed. Ethan ate watching Mercer, and Mercer sat with his hands around his third cup of coffee and let the boy watch him without looking away or performing anything. After breakfast, Clara sent them outside to sit on the porch. The mud was drying and the morning had warmed a little, and she needed to talk to Mercer without them hearing. She waited until she could see them through the window, Ethan sitting on the porch step with Lydia beside him, the girl pulling idly at a loose thread on her dress. Eleanor is going to come here, Clara said. Yes. How much authority does she actually have? Legally. Mercer turned the cup in his hands. More than she should. I've been careless about it. When I'm away for extended periods, I've given her power to manage household affairs. That extends to the children's welfare. He stopped. Which means if she chose to push it, she could argue she has the right to determine where they live and how they're disciplined. That's an argument a judge would need to settle. There's no judge in Harrow's Creek. There's the justice of the peace. Mercer gave her a look. I know, Clara said. Harlan Gibbs. He's not a formidable man. She thought of the postmaster, his habit of resolving disputes in whichever direction caused him the least paperwork. But he's what we have unless we send to the county seat, and that's 2 days' ride. Eleanor won't wait 2 days. No, Clara agreed. She won't. She stood at the window for a moment, watching the children. Lydia had stopped pulling at the thread on her dress and was looking at something in the yard. A bird, Clara thought, a sparrow hopping through the wet grass. The girl's face was completely still, but her eyes were tracking the bird with something that might, if you squinted, be called interest. Tell me about Eleanor, Clara said. Not just what she did to the children. Tell me what kind of woman she is. Mercer considered this. She is the most organized person I have ever met, he said finally. She keeps records of everything. Every expenditure, every contract, every conversation she thinks might be useful later. She remembers what people want and what they're afraid of, and she is not above using both. He paused. She genuinely believes she is right. That's the part that's hardest to argue with. She doesn't think she was abusing those children. She thinks she was correcting them. Correcting a 4-year-old by locking her in a cellar. In her mind, weakness is learned behavior. You correct it by refusing to accommodate it. His voice was flat. I've heard her say it. I told myself she applied it to household management, not to children. You told yourself a lot of things. Yes. No deflection, no qualification, just the word, sitting there. Clara turned from the window. All right, here's what I think. Eleanor will come to get the children, and she'll have some piece of paper that says she has the right to take them. She'll also come with whatever she's managed to gather about me, because if I'm going to be an obstacle, she'll want to neutralize me first. That's how people like her operate. They don't fight you head on. They find the thing you're afraid of losing, and they put their hand on it. Mercer looked at her. What are you afraid of losing? My position, Clara said without hesitating. I'm an unmarried woman teaching school on the frontier. My reputation is all the authority I have. If Eleanor decides to question my character, why I sheltered 2 children alone in my cabin overnight, why a man spent the night in my lean-to, she can make it very difficult for me to keep my post. I'm sorry, he said. I didn't think of that. You wouldn't have. You don't have to think about it. She said it without bitterness. It was just true. But I'm telling you now so you understand what she's going to try. And so you understand that I'm going in with my eyes open. He looked at her for a moment. Why would you? Go in at all, I mean. You could hand the children over and walk away. It would be the safer thing. Clara thought of Lydia pulling the quilt up to her chin in the night. She thought of Ethan's voice. She's just scared. She's not slow. Steady and certain and heartbroken. I'm a school teacher, she said. I've spent 4 years watching what happens to children when the adults around them decide the safer thing is to look away. I'm not going to be another one of those adults. Mercer was quiet. Then, I need to go back to the property and remove Eleanor before she can get to you. If I can get her out of the house today. And if she refuses, she's your father's sister. Can you actually remove her? She's in my house, he said. My property. My legal household. That's not what I asked. Another pause, longer this time. Probably not, he said. Not without a fight I'm not ready for. Then we don't do it that way. Clara sat down at the table. If you ride back there alone, she'll have time to prepare. She'll have legal papers drawn up. I'd bet she's already working on it. She'll get to Harlan Gibbs before you can, and she'll have him half convinced by the time you arrive. She looked at him. We need to be somewhere she doesn't control the ground. Where? Here, Clara said. We wait for her to come to us, and when she does, we're ready. But Eleanor Mercer arrived at noon. She did not come alone. She brought 2 men, not riders like the night before, but townsmen. Harlan Gibbs, the justice of the peace, swaying slightly on his horse and looking uncomfortable about the whole situation, and a man Clara recognized as Devin Carr, who ran the dry goods store and served as the settlement's informal notary when documents needed witnessing. Eleanor herself was in a buggy. She was a woman in her late 60s, small and upright, with the kind of posture that announces itself before anything else does. Her dress was plain but well made, her gray hair pinned severely. She looked like someone's respectable grandmother, and she moved like someone who had never once in her life been surprised by a door that didn't open for her. Clara was standing on her porch when they arrived. Mercer was behind her, to her left, which they had agreed was the right placement, present but not leading. Ethan and Lydia were inside with the door closed. Eleanor's driver stopped the buggy, and she descended without waiting for help, which was the first thing Clara noted. A woman who didn't need anyone's hand was a woman who had decided a long time ago not to owe anyone anything. Mr. Gibbs, Clara said, what brings you out? Harlan Gibbs cleared his throat. He was a thin man, balding, with the deeply unhappy expression of someone who had hoped to spend the day behind a counter. Miss Winslow, That is, we've received a Mrs. Eleanor Mercer has presented. I'll speak for myself, Harlan, Eleanor said without looking at him. She looked at Clara. Miss Winslow, I believe you have my grandchildren. Your grandnephews, Clara said. And niece. A pause, just barely. My grandnephews, Eleanor repeated. I've been sick with worry. I'd like them returned to me. They're not mine to return. They're Mr. Mercer's wards. Clara nodded toward Caleb. He's standing right there. Eleanor's eyes moved to Caleb for the first time. Something passed between them. Not quite a greeting, not anything warm, more like two people measuring a distance. Caleb, she said, Aunt Eleanor. I've brought Mr. Gibbs because your behavior last night was erratic, and I was concerned. My behavior, Caleb said. He said it quietly, but something in the quiet made Eleanor stop. I came home and found a child's blanket and a bucket in a locked cellar. I'd call my behavior last night the most rational thing I've done in years. Eleanor's chin lifted slightly. Lydia requires firm management. She's 4 years old. She's a difficult child. You've never spent enough time at home to understand the demands she places on. She doesn't talk, Caleb said. She's 4 years old and she doesn't talk. Do you understand what it takes to make a 4-year-old stop talking? Eleanor looked at him with an expression that Clara could only describe as practiced patience, the look of someone who has decided that the person arguing with them is simply not sophisticated enough to understand. She was using her silence as a manipulation. Children do that. You'd know that if you were here. I'm here now. After the fact. Eleanor turned back to Clara, dismissing Caleb in a single movement. Miss Winslow, I have here. She opened a small leather case and produced a folded document. A letter from the county circuit clerk confirming my authority over household management during Mr. Mercer's absences. Mr. Carr has reviewed it and can confirm its validity. Devin Carr, still on his horse, nodded unhappily. That authority covers the management of household affairs, Clara said. Does it cover the medical and physical welfare of minor children? Eleanor looked at her. It covers household affairs. The children are part of this household. Children aren't part of a household, Clara said. They're people, and a person's physical welfare is a separate legal question from who runs the pantry. She had not been certain about this. She had reasoned it out over the past 2 hours while she and Mercer talked, turning the logic over and looking at it from different angles, and she thought it was probably right. And more importantly, she thought Eleanor's document probably didn't specifically address it, and she was counting on the fact that Harlan Gibbs didn't want to have this argument on a Tuesday. She was right about that last part. Gibbs was looking between them with the expression of a man who deeply wished he had not come. Miss Winslow, Eleanor said. Her voice had changed. Still controlled, but something under it now. The first hint that she was not entirely comfortable with how this was going. I understand you're trying to protect the children. That's admirable. But you're a school teacher, a single woman. You have no legal standing in a matter of guardianship. I'm a witness, Clara said. And witnesses have standing. A witness to what? To the condition of 2 children who arrived at my door last night in a storm, in fear. Clara kept her voice even. To a little girl who doesn't speak. To a 6-year-old boy who knew exactly what would happen to his sister if he didn't get her out of that house. Eleanor's eyes narrowed, just slightly. You're making serious accusations. I'm making observations. Clara looked at Gibbs. Harlan, I'm asking you, as the justice of the peace, for this settlement, to delay any decision about custody of these children until the matter of their welfare can be properly reviewed. Gibbs rubbed the back of his neck. Now, Miss Winslow, I'm not sure there are legal documents here. There are children in my cabin who ran away from a locked cellar, Clara said. That's also a legal matter. Silence. The morning was warm enough that the mud was steaming faintly, thin tendrils of mist rising off the yard between them. Eleanor turned back to Caleb. Her voice dropped, and it was no longer performing patience. It was something else, something that had gotten used to getting what it wanted from this particular man. Caleb, don't do this. You know how this ends. You know what happens to a woman's reputation when she inserts herself into family matters that aren't hers. You know what this will do to your standing in the county. Come home. Bring the children. We can discuss adjustments to the household if you feel Adjustments, Caleb said. To your concerns. My concerns. He looked at her for a moment. Eleanor, I want you to hear me. I'm not coming home today. The children aren't coming home today. You're going to go back to the house and you're going to wait there while I make arrangements. And then we are going to have a very different conversation than any we have had before. Eleanor looked at him. Then she looked at Clara. It was the kind of look that doesn't carry any particular expression. That's what made it unsettling. It was a look that was filing things away. Very well, she said. She folded the document and returned it to the leather case. Harlan, thank you for accompanying me. She got back into the buggy. She did not look at either of them again. As the buggy turned and started back toward the road, Clara let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Her hands were steady. She was mildly surprised by that. That went better than I expected, Mercer said quietly beside her. No, it didn't, Claire said. She's not done. She just went to figure out which angle to use. She turned and went back inside, because the children would want to know what had happened, and because she needed to think, and because standing on the porch watching Eleanor Mercer's buggy disappear down the road felt too much like something she didn't want it to feel like. That afternoon was strange and suspended, the way afternoons can be when everyone in a room knows something is coming, but no one knows quite when. Mercer rode back to his property to speak to his foreman, a man named Thaddeus Greer who had worked the land for 15 years and who, Mercer said, was the most honest person in his employ by a considerable margin. He wanted to understand exactly what Greer had seen over the past months. He wanted it in words he could use. Clara sat with the children. Ethan had questions, which she answered as honestly as she could, which meant telling him that his aunt had come and gone, and that things were not yet settled, and that no one was going to take him anywhere today. He listened to all of this with the same focused attention he'd shown her since the night before, and she found herself thinking that whatever else Eleanor Mercer had done, she had not managed to make this boy small. Frightened, yes. Cautious, yes. But not small. Will we have to go to court? Ethan asked. Clara looked at him. Where did you hear about court? Mrs. Eleanor told Uncle Caleb once that she could take anyone to court if she needed to. She said courts always listen to people who know what they're doing. Courts listen to evidence, Clara said. That's different. What's evidence? Proof. Things you can show are true. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then, I have some of that. Clara looked at him. What do you mean? The boy reached into the inner pocket of his coat. The good wool coat with the brass buttons, which had dried by the fire and was hanging on the peg by the door, and produced a folded piece of paper. He held it out to her. She took it and unfolded it carefully. It was a letter. Written in a precise small hand, Eleanor's hand, she would later confirm, addressed to someone named Aldous, who appeared to be a solicitor in the county seat. The letter discussed, in careful and entirely businesslike language, the process for having a minor child declared incompetent due to what Eleanor called developmental deficiency and willful mutism, and the legal steps involved in transferring guardianship away from a negligent male relative to a more capable household manager. Clara read it twice. Where did you get this? She said. She threw it away, Ethan said. She threw it in the fire bucket. I took it out when she wasn't looking. He looked at the letter in Clara's hands. I didn't know what it said. I just thought, she threw a lot of things away, and sometimes they were important, and I thought maybe this one was too. Clara looked at this 6-year-old boy who had been quietly, carefully collecting evidence in a house where he had understood, on some instinctive animal level, that the adults around him were not safe. She felt something in her chest that was not quite sadness and not quite admiration, and was probably both at once. You thought right, she said. She folded the letter and held it. Outside, Lydia had moved to the porch step, the first time she had gone anywhere without Ethan in her immediate reach, and was sitting in the afternoon sun with her feet dangling, watching the sparrow that had come back to the yard. Clara watched the little girl watching the bird. Lydia's lips moved, just barely. No sound came out that Clara could hear, but her lips moved in a shape that might have been a word, or the beginning of one, something small and cautious, like a door opening just a crack to see what the weather was like before deciding whether to come all the way out. Clara did not say anything about it. She just noted it the way you note something you want to remember, something you suspect might be important later. When Mercer came back that evening, she handed him the letter. He read it standing up, still in his riding coat, and his face went through several things in quick succession that he didn't bother to hide. When he looked up, his expression had settled into something she hadn't seen on him before. Not anger exactly, but something harder and more purposeful. "Ethan found this," Clara said, "in a fire bucket. He didn't know what it was. He just knew enough to save it." Mercer looked at the boy, who was sitting at the table eating the supper Clara had put together from what she had left in her larder. "You've been paying attention," Mercer said to him. Ethan looked up. "Someone had to." Mercer nodded once, slowly. It wasn't the nod of an adult acknowledging a clever child. It was closer to the nod of one person recognizing something in another person that they respect. "Thaddeus Greer will speak," Mercer told Clara, when Ethan had gone back to eating. "He said he's been waiting for someone to ask. He's seen things he wishes he hadn't. He's ready to say so. He needs to be ready to say so in front of Harlan Gibbs, or whoever's going to hear this." "I know." Mercer folded the letter and tucked it into his coat. "I'm going to send a rider to the county seat tonight. There's a proper circuit judge due through in 3 days. I want him to make the stop here." He looked at Clara. "This doesn't get resolved in Eleanor's favor again. Not this time." Clara looked at him, at the letter in his coat pocket, at the 2 children at her table. "No," she said, "it doesn't." The rider Mercer sent to the county seat left before dark, pushing hard on a fresh horse with a letter in his saddlebag that Mercer had written at Clara's table by firelight, his handwriting tight and deliberate, the kind of handwriting that comes from a man who does not trust himself to say something clearly unless he forces himself to slow down. He had not asked Clara to read it before he sealed it. She had not asked to. There was something in the gesture, the writing of it, the sealing, the sending, that felt like the first thing he had done in a long time that he was certain about, and she didn't want to interfere with that. The next 2 days were the kind of quiet that isn't restful. Clara sent word to the settlement school board that she was unwell. Not a lie, exactly, since she hadn't slept properly in 2 nights, and the low headache that had settled in behind her eyes showed no sign of leaving. She kept the children at the cabin. Mercer rode out each morning and returned each evening, and the pattern of it settled into something that resembled a household without anyone deciding it would. Ethan helped Clara carry water from the creek. Lydia sat in the yard most afternoons and watched the sparrow, which had apparently decided the yard was worth returning to. And sometimes Clara watched Lydia watching the bird and thought about the words she'd almost seen the girl's lips form that first afternoon. It didn't happen again. Or if it did, Clara didn't catch it. On the evening of the second day, Mercer came back from town with his jaw set in a way that told her something had shifted. "Eleanor's been talking," he said. He sat at the table and put his hat down and looked at it instead of at her. "She's been talking to people in town. About you." Clara had expected this. Expecting it didn't make hearing it easier. What is she saying? That you've inserted yourself into a private family matter for reasons that aren't— He stopped, chose the word carefully. "Respectable." "She's implying I have an interest in you." "Yes. That's why she brought Devin Carr the other day," Clara said. "She knew she'd need a witness, someone who could say he'd seen you come out of my lean-to in the morning." Mercer looked up. "I should have thought of that." "Neither of us thought of everything." Clara stood at the window. The yard was going dark, and the sparrow was gone, and Lydia had come inside and was sitting on the bed, quiet and still, listening to everything the way she always listened. Not obviously, not with her eyes on the speaker, but with a particular quality of stillness that meant she was taking it all in. Clara kept her voice even because of that, though it cost her something. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that Martin Quill told me this afternoon he's reconsidering whether the school board should—" He stopped again. "Whether the school board should what?" "Whether your contract should be renewed in the fall." Clara turned from the window. Martin Quill was the head of the school board, a man who owned a feed store and 3 lots on the main road, and who had the specific combination of ambition and cowardice that made him very susceptible to the opinions of people he considered important. Eleanor Mercer was, by any measure that mattered to Martin Quill, a person he considered important. "She moved fast," Clara said. "She's had 2 days. 2 days and she's already at the school board." Clara sat down. She felt the headache pulse once, hard, behind her left eye. She knows the judge is coming. She has to. I didn't hide it. Mercer's voice had a flat anger in it. I thought if she knew there was going to be a proper hearing, she'd back down, pull back, try to negotiate. She's not going to negotiate, Clara said. She's going to try to win. And she's going to try to win by making sure neither of us has any credibility left before the judge gets here. Mercer was quiet. The fire settled in the grate. From the bed, Lydia made no sound, but her small fingers had found the loose thread on her dress again and were working it slowly, the way they did when she was thinking. I'm sorry, Mercer said. This is because of me. You're in this because I couldn't, because I let it go on too long, and now you're the one paying for it. Yes, Clara said, not cruelly, just honestly. But I'm here anyway, so let's figure out what we do next. He looked at her. She thought she saw something move through his expression, surprise maybe, or something like relief that he didn't entirely trust. She understood that. She didn't entirely trust it herself. What I know, she said, is that we have the letter Ethan found. We have Thaddeus Greer's testimony. We have 2 children who can speak to what happened in that house. She paused. And we have Eleanor's own behavior over the past 2 days. She's talked to the school board. She's trying to damage my character. If we can show a judge that she's been doing that while simultaneously claiming she's only motivated by concern for the children, that's useful. It shows she's operating strategically, Mercer said. It shows she's operating strategically against the people standing between her and the children, Clara said. That's a different thing than a woman trying to protect her grandnephews. They sat with that for a moment. The judge gets here tomorrow, Mercer said, or the day after, depending on the roads. Then we're ready tomorrow, Clara said, or the day after. So, the judge arrived the next afternoon, which Clara considered either fortunate timing or evidence that fate occasionally had the decency to move efficiently. His name was Emmett Hale. No relation to the children, that was just the territory's habit of reusing surnames. And he was a compact man in his late 50s with a gray beard trimmed close and the kind of permanently tired expression that comes from spending 20 years riding a circuit through towns that mostly wanted you to settle things the way they'd already decided they should be settled. He set up in the feed store, which was the largest interior space in Harrow's Creek, and which Martin Quill had offered with a nervousness that suggested he was already regretting every decision he'd made in the past 72 hours. There were no proper courtroom benches, so people stood, or brought chairs from home, or leaned against the feed sacks stacked along the walls. By mid-morning, nearly every adult in the settlement had found a reason to be present, which was how things worked in small places when something genuinely interesting was happening. Clara had not slept again. She was past the point where that registered as unusual. She had dressed carefully, which she recognized as its own kind of statement. Her best dress, the dark green wool, her hair pinned as neatly as she could manage, which was not perfectly neat but was as neat as it was going to get. She had thought about this. Eleanor would arrive looking composed and respectable and entirely in command of herself, and Clara was not going to give anyone in that room the luxury of writing her off as a woman who had lost her head over something. Ethan stood beside her when they walked in. He had combed his hair. He was wearing his brass-buttoned coat, which had dried without losing its shape, and he walked with his shoulders back in a way that looked less like confidence and more like a decision to appear confident, which Clara found she respected more. Lydia held her brother's hand and did not look at anyone. Eleanor was already there when they arrived. She had a man with her that Clara didn't recognize, a solicitor, almost certainly, brought up from the county seat, which meant she'd sent her own rider at some point, and Clara hadn't known about it. The solicitor was young, well-dressed, carrying a leather case that was thicker than Mercer's had been. He had the settled proprietary manner of someone who had already written the ending of this proceeding in his head. Eleanor looked at Clara when she walked in. The look lasted about 3 seconds and contained nothing readable. Clara looked back and then looked away because she needed to find Mercer, and because staring at Eleanor Mercer was not going to accomplish anything. Mercer was near the front, with Thaddeus Greer beside him. Greer was a broad, weathered man, somewhere past 60, with the careful, unhurried movements of someone who had spent most of his life doing physical work and had learned that economy of motion was a form of wisdom. He looked uncomfortable in the feed store, The way men look when they've been asked to perform something they usually only do in private. But his discomfort had a settled quality to it, like a man who had decided to do an uncomfortable thing and was not going to be talked out of it. Clara nodded to him. He nodded back. Judge Hale called the proceeding to order with less ceremony than Clara had expected, which she liked. He explained that this was an informal inquiry, not a formal trial, but that his findings would carry legal weight and would be forwarded to the county circuit for formal recording. He looked at Eleanor's solicitor when he said this, and then at Clara, and his expression said roughly that he had seen this kind of thing before and did not have a lot of patience for theater. Eleanor's solicitor went first. He presented the document establishing Eleanor's household authority, and a second document, new Clara noted, drawn up in the past 2 days, that argued Caleb Mercer's habitual absence constituted a form of negligence, and that Eleanor's management of the household had been conducted in the children's best interests. He was efficient and organized and chose his words the way you'd lay bricks, solidly, one on top of another, building something that looked stable because it had no gaps you could see from the outside. Then he said something that Clara had not anticipated. He said that the schoolteacher Clara Winslow had, on the night in question, harbored the children without notifying their guardian, had allowed a man, Caleb Mercer, to spend the night on her property without a chaperone, and had subsequently inserted herself into a family legal matter in ways that suggested either a personal entanglement with Caleb Mercer or a reckless disregard for the proper boundaries of her position. The feed store went quiet, in the particular way it does when a room full of people all have the same thought at the same time and are waiting to see who says it first. Clara felt her face go carefully neutral. She had expected this argument. She had known it was coming. That did not stop the hot, clean anger of hearing it spoken out loud in a room full of her neighbors. Mercer stood up. "That's enough," he said. Judge Hale looked at him. "Mr. Mercer, sit down. You'll have your opportunity." "She sheltered 2 children who came to her door in a storm," Mercer said. He didn't raise his voice, but he didn't sit down either. "She kept them safe. That's what she did. Any implication beyond that is, Mr. Mercer," Judge Hale said, and this time there was something in his voice that was not a request. Mercer sat. His jaw was tight enough to ache, Clara could tell from where she was standing. When it was their turn, Mercer presented the letter Ethan had found. Eleanor's solicitor objected that the provenance was questionable. A child had retrieved it from a waste bucket. How could they be certain of its authenticity? Judge Hale looked at the letter for a long time. He looked at the handwriting. He looked at Eleanor. He did not rule on the objection immediately, which Clara read as meaning he was uncertain, which was not what she'd hoped for. Thaddeus Greer testified next. He spoke slowly, in the way of a man who has thought carefully about what he wants to say and is going to say it exactly that way, regardless of how long it takes. He described 3 specific incidents he had witnessed over the past year. Lydia locked in the cellar on 2 separate occasions, the second time for what he believed was at least 6 hours. Ethan being denied meals on days when Eleanor determined his behavior had been unsatisfactory. And a night in January when he had heard sounds from the cellar that he described as a child making sounds of distress and had gone to Eleanor and been told to mind his work. "Why didn't you come forward before?" Judge Hale asked. Greer looked at his hands. "I was afraid of losing my position," he said. "I've got a family. I told myself it wasn't as bad as it seemed." He paused. "I was wrong. I knew I was wrong. He stopped. "I should have said something sooner. I know that." Eleanor's solicitor moved to discredit him. Long employment relationship with Mercer, possible loyalty bias, couldn't be certain of what he'd heard through cellar walls. Greer answered each question in the same slow, deliberate way. He didn't get flustered. He didn't retreat. He just kept saying what he'd seen, and the repetition of it had its own weight. Then Judge Hale looked at Ethan. He did it carefully, which Clara noted, not addressing the boy directly yet, just looking at him. Ethan looked back. He was still standing with his shoulders in that deliberate set, and his face was the face of someone who has made a decision and is living inside it. "Son," Judge Hale said, "do you understand what's happening here today?" "Yes, sir," Ethan said. "Can you tell me what you think is happening?" Ethan glanced at Clara, just once, quickly. She gave him nothing, not a nod, not a smile, just her attention. He needed to do this without her. He looked back at the judge. "You're trying to figure out if my Aunt Eleanor was hurting us," he said, "and whether she should be allowed to take us back." "That's about right," Judge Hale said. "Do you want to tell me anything?" And Ethan talked. He talked for almost 20 minutes. He talked about the cellar and the meals and the winter night in January that Greer had referred to. He talked about it from the inside, from where he had been, upstairs with his ear against the floorboards listening to his sister. He talked about how Eleanor had told him, on multiple occasions, that Lydia's silence was a manipulation and that he was making it worse by accommodating it. That a real brother would make her speak instead of carrying her around like she was made of glass. He talked about how he had started saving things, letters, notes, scraps of conversations he'd overheard, because he had understood, in the wordless way that children understand things before they have the language for it, that he might need proof someday. He talked steadily and without crying, which Clara thought was either a sign of extraordinary composure or evidence of how many times he had already lived through these things in his memory. Maybe both. When he was done, the feed store was very quiet. Eleanor's solicitor said, "The boy is 6 years old and has clearly been coached." It was the wrong thing to say. Clara saw it in the room before she saw it in Judge Hale's face. A shift in the air, a collective stillness that meant the people in that room had made up their minds about something, and the solicitor had just confirmed it. Judge Hale looked at the solicitor for a long moment. "That boy," he said, "just gave a more coherent account of events than most adult witnesses I've heard in 20 years on the circuit." He looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked back at him. Her composure was intact. It had been intact the entire time, which Clara had watched with a kind of grim admiration, because whatever else Eleanor Mercer was, she was not a woman who broke under pressure. She had sat through Greer's testimony and Ethan's testimony with the same upright, patient stillness, and she had the expression of someone waiting for an argument they've already won to be officially declared. "Mrs. Mercer," Judge Hale said, "do you have anything to say?" "I have managed that household for 11 years, Eleanor said. Her voice was composed and clear. "I have done so under difficult circumstances, with inadequate support, and I have kept those children clothed and fed and educated. The methods I've used have been the methods of a woman who understands that children require discipline, not indulgence. I make no apology for that." "The cellar," Judge Hale said. "Lydia was placed in the cellar on 2 occasions for limited periods after she had exhibited behavior that—" "She was 4 years old," Judge Hale said. "Children require—" "She was 4 years old," he said again, and something in his voice closed the conversation. Then something happened that no one had planned for. Lydia let go of Ethan's hand. It was such a small movement that it took a moment for the people nearby to register it. She had been standing beside her brother the entire time, her fingers wrapped in his, her eyes on the floor. She let go, and she took 1 step forward, and she looked at Eleanor Mercer. The room noticed. The quiet that followed was different from the earlier quiet. It had a different texture, a held quality, like a breath. Lydia's lips moved. It wasn't loud. It wasn't by any technical measure the kind of thing that should carry across a room full of people, but the room was so still that it did. "She locked the door," Lydia said. 3 words. Her voice was rough from disuse and very small and entirely steady. "She locked the door and she didn't come back." It was the first thing Lydia had said in months. Clara knew that. The room didn't know that, not most of them, but they felt the weight of it anyway. Felt that this was not a rehearsed line, not something coached, that it had come from somewhere too deep and too specific to have been planted there by someone else. Eleanor's expression did not change. That was the thing that Clara would remember afterward. In the moment when a 4-year-old spoke for the first time in months to describe being locked alone in a dark cellar, Eleanor Mercer's expression did not change. It remained patient and composed and faintly irritated. And that non-reaction said more than anything Eleanor's solicitor had put into his leather case. Ethan made a sound beside his sister. Not a word, just a sound. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they stood there like that, 2 children who had been holding each other up for months, in front of a room full of adults who should have been paying attention sooner. Clara did not look at Mercer. She didn't need to. Judge Hale looked at Eleanor for a long moment. Then he looked at his papers. He wrote something down, deliberately, in the way of a man who wants to make clear that he is creating a record. "I'm going to take a recess," he said. 1 hour. He stood up and walked out of the feed store without looking at anyone. Eleanor's solicitor leaned toward her and began speaking in a low voice. Eleanor listened with her eyes on the middle distance, not on the children, not on Clara, not on anything in particular. Just waiting, the way she had waited through all of it, as if she had calculated her position and found it acceptable, and was simply waiting for the calculation to resolve in her favor. Clara walked to the children. She crouched down in front of Lydia, which put her at the girl's level, and she looked at her and said quietly, "You did something very hard just now." Lydia looked at her. Her dark eyes were steady, just as they had been that first night in the cabin when she'd watched Clara from over the edge of the quilt. "She locked the door," Lydia said again. Quieter this time, just to Clara. "I kept knocking. She didn't come back." "I know," Clara said. "I believe you." Ethan pressed his face briefly against the top of his sister's head. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Clara straightened up and found Mercer at her elbow. He had moved without her noticing, which meant he'd moved quietly and on purpose. "She's not going to let this go," Clara said, keeping her voice low. "Even if Hale rules against her today, she's going to find another angle." "I know," Mercer said. "We need him to make findings, specific findings, not just a temporary arrangement, something in the county record that she can't quietly work around later. I'm going to talk to him during the recess." "So am I," Clara said. Mercer looked at her. "Hale won't expect that." "I know." She straightened her cuffs. "He'll get used to it." She walked toward the door through which the judge had exited, past a cluster of townspeople who parted for her in the automatic way that people part for someone moving with intention, and she was aware of eyes on her back, of Devon Carr watching with an uncomfortable expression, of Martin Quill near the wall looking like a man whose fence-sitting had gotten structurally unsound, of Eleanor's solicitor noting her movement with the flat professional attention of someone logging a development. She was also aware that her teaching contract might not survive this day, and that her reputation in Harrow's Creek had already been altered in ways that might not be entirely reversible, and that she had walked into all of this with her eyes open on the second morning of knowing these children. She didn't stop walking. She had made her accounting. She had made it the night she opened her door in a storm and looked at a 6-year-old boy holding his sister in the rain, and everything since then had just been the consequence of that one decision, spreading out the way water spreads from a single point of contact, inexorable, finding every low place, going where it had to go. Outside, Judge Hale was standing at the edge of the road with a cup of something warm, looking at the sky. He heard her coming and turned, and his expression when he saw it was her had the particular quality of a man recalibrating an expectation. "Miss Winslow," he said. "Judge Hale," she said. "I have some thoughts, if you'll hear them." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at the sky. "You've got an hour," he said. "Talk." She talked for 40 minutes. Judge Hale did not interrupt her often, which she took as a sign that he was actually listening rather than waiting for her to finish. She told him about the letter Ethan had found, and why its provenance mattered, not just as evidence of Eleanor's intentions toward Lydia, but as evidence of a pattern of planning, of deliberate action rather than the impulsive mistakes of an overwhelmed woman. She told him about Eleanor's visit to the school board, and what it said about how Eleanor operated when she felt threatened. She told him about Lydia's silence, and what Ethan had said about the night it began, and she told him this part carefully, without embellishment, because she was a woman who understood that the difference between testimony and advocacy was the difference between being useful and being dismissed. She told him what she needed from him, not just a temporary ruling on custody, a formal finding entered into the county record that the children had been subjected to treatment that warranted investigation. Something Eleanor couldn't quietly negotiate around once Hale had ridden on to the next stop on his circuit. Hale listened. He drank his coffee. When she was done, he looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not quite approval and not quite its opposite. "You're a school teacher," he said. "Yes." "Not a solicitor." "No." "You argue like one." "I've had to learn to make my case clearly," Clara said. "It's the same skill." He looked at his cup. "The implication about your character, the school board business, that bothers you." "Of course it bothers me." "What do you want me to do about it?" I want you to make findings that make it clear the accusations were part of a strategy, Claire said. I'm not asking you to defend my honor. I'm asking you to put the truth in the record so that anyone who looks at it later can see what was actually happening. Hale was quiet for a moment. A wagon went past on the road, and neither of them looked at it. You understand, he said, that even if I make every finding you're asking for, it doesn't guarantee anything. She has money. She has connections at the county level. People like Eleanor Mercer don't just stop. I know that, Clara said, but right now she's operating in the dark. Every specific finding you make is a light she can't turn off. It changes what she can do next. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. Not warmth, exactly, but a kind of recognition. The look of someone who has spent 20 years watching people either fight for what matters or find reasons not to, and has learned to tell the difference. Go back inside, he said. I'll be in shortly. The hour passed in the specific discomfort of a room full of people who had nothing to do but wait and be aware of each other. Clara sat with the children on a feed sack near the east wall. Ethan had gone quiet in the way he went quiet when he was thinking hard, his eyes slightly unfocused, his hands still in his lap. Lydia sat close against his side. She had not spoken again since the 3 words that had stopped the room, but there was something different about her silence now. It was harder to explain than to feel. Before, her silence had been the silence of a door closed and latched. Now it felt more like a door that was closed but no longer locked. Mercer sat on Clara's other side. He had been in to speak with Judge Hale himself during the recess, separately, and he hadn't told her what was said, and she hadn't asked. Whatever he'd needed to say it without her constructing it for him. Eleanor was across the room with her solicitor. They were speaking in low voices. Eleanor's posture had not changed. Her solicitor's had. He was leaning toward her more than he had been before, and his voice, while inaudible, had a different quality, like a man reassessing. Thaddeus Greer stood near the door. He had not sat down the entire recess. He just stood there with his hat in his hands, looking at the floor, occasionally at the children, in the quiet, miserable way of a man who has done the right thing too late and is carrying that specific weight. Clara looked at him. He caught her eye and looked away, and then back. She nodded at him, just once. He nodded back, and something in his shoulders eased fractionally. Judge Hale came back in at the end of the hour and called the room to order and spent a few minutes doing what judges do when they are about to say something important and want everyone to understand that it is important. Adjusting papers, looking at the room, letting the silence settle. Then he spoke. He began with the household authority document. He affirmed its legal validity, but stated clearly that authority over household management did not extend to authority over the physical welfare and discipline of minor children in ways that conflicted with their basic safety. He noted that the document's scope was administrative and that it had been applied beyond its intended parameters. Eleanor's solicitor started to object. Hale looked at him. The solicitor stopped. Hale then addressed Thaddeus Greer's testimony. He said that he found Greer to be a credible witness and that the incidents described, the cellar confinements, the denial of meals, constituted treatment that fell below any reasonable standard of care for minor children. He noted the consistency between Greer's account and Ethan's account and observed that consistency across independent witnesses was, in his experience, the most reliable indicator of truth. He addressed the letter. He looked at it again, briefly, and said that while its provenance was unusual, the handwriting was consistent with other samples of Eleanor's correspondence that had been presented, and that the content suggested a premeditated effort to legally diminish Lydia's standing in ways that would benefit Eleanor's position. He was careful about this. He did not call it fraud, but he entered it into the record with a notation that the county circuit should review it in the context of any subsequent proceedings. Then he said the thing Clara had asked him to say. He said that the accusations made against Clara Winslow, the implications regarding her character and her motivations, appeared, based on the timeline of events and the evidence presented, to be part of a deliberate strategy to discredit a witness. He said this plainly and without qualification, and he looked at Eleanor when he said it, and Eleanor looked back at him with that same composed patience. And Clara thought, watching her, that Eleanor had probably known this outcome was possible and had already calculated what came next. The children, Hale said, returning to his papers, will remain in the custody of Caleb Mercer, their legal guardian of record. Mrs. Eleanor Mercer's household authority is suspended pending county review. She is to have no unsupervised contact with the children until that review is completed. He paused. Furthermore, I am referring the matter of the children's treatment to the county sheriff for investigation of potential criminal conduct. That is not a determination. It is a referral. The determination will be made through the appropriate channel. The feed store was very quiet. Eleanor's solicitor leaned toward her. She put one hand up, just slightly, and he stopped. "Judge Hale," Eleanor said. Her voice was exactly as composed as it had been at the beginning of the day. "I want to note for the record that I have served that household faithfully for 11 years, that I have kept those children alive and clothed and educated under circumstances that would have broken a lesser woman, and that whatever findings you enter today, the record of my service speaks for itself." Hale looked at her. "Noted," he said. Not warmly. He closed his papers. It was over in the technical sense, the formal part of it, the part with legal weight. The room began to move, the way rooms move when a held breath gets released, people shifting and murmuring and turning to each other. Clara sat still for a moment in the middle of it. She was aware of her own heartbeat, which had been elevated for so long that she'd stopped noticing it, and of the headache still present behind her left eye, duller now, but persistent. Ethan tugged her sleeve. She looked at him. "Is it done?" he asked. "Part of it," she said. "The important part." He thought about this. "She's going to try something else," he said. "Probably," Clara said, "but it'll be harder now, and there are more people watching." He nodded. He looked across the room at Eleanor, who was still seated, still speaking quietly with her solicitor, still entirely composed. He looked at her the way you look at something you understand to be dangerous and are not pretending otherwise. Then he looked away, because he was 6 years old, and there were limits to how long anyone should have to look at the thing that frightened them. What happened in the hour after the proceedings ended was not dramatic. It was the kind of thing that happens in small towns when a public event resolves in a way that changes the social landscape. Everyone suddenly needing to speak to everyone else, positions being quietly revised, people who had been sitting on fences discovering they had strong opinions after all. Martin Quill found Clara near the door. He was a man who had the particular discomfort of someone who had committed to a position and then watched the ground shift beneath it, and he handled this discomfort by getting to her before she could leave and saying, with the forced casualness of a man performing sincerity, "Miss Winslow, I hope you understand that the school board's concerns were, that is, given the circumstances, we can see that the situation was misrepresented to us." "Martin," Clara said. He stopped. "Don't," she said. Don't tell me the school board was misled. You chose to listen. You can choose differently next time." His mouth worked for a moment. He was not accustomed to being spoken to this way, and she knew that, and she also knew that she was past the point of managing his comfort for him. "Your contract," he said after a moment. "It won't be an issue." "Good," Clara said, and walked past him. Devon Carr caught her eye from across the room and gave her a nod that had the quality of an apology without actually being one, which was about what she expected from Devon Carr, and she returned it with the same quality, which was about all he deserved. Mercer was outside when she got there. He was standing with Greer in the street, and they were talking in the quiet way of two men who have worked the same land for a long time and have found, in the aftermath of a difficult thing, that they respect each other. When Clara came out, Greer looked at her and said, "Miss Winslow, I'm sorry I didn't speak sooner." "You spoke when it mattered," Clara said. It was not entirely a comfort, and she didn't try to make it sound like one, because he deserved better than a false comfort. But it was true, and he seemed to receive it as such, because he nodded and put his hat back on and said he'd better get back to the property. There were things needed doing. When Greer had gone, Mercer looked at Clara. "Hale told me what you said to him during the recess," he said. "He told you?" "Enough of it." Something moved across his face. "You asked for the school board finding to go in the record. It needed to be there. You did that knowing it would—" He stopped. "It draws more attention to the accusation, even refuting it." "Yes," Clara said, "but the alternative was letting it sit unaddressed in the record as if it were a live question. This way it's answered." She looked at him. I've spent 4 years building something here. I'm not going to let it be dismantled by implication. He was quiet for a moment. That's not the only reason. She looked at him. You wanted it in the record so it could be seen clearly for what it was, he said. What she did. The way she operates. You wanted it documented. Clara didn't answer immediately. He wasn't wrong. She had wanted both things simultaneously, and she didn't see why having a personal stake in something meant the other reasons weren't real. Both things can be true, she said. He nodded slowly. His jaw was less tight than it had been all day, which she noted as a kind of progress. The children came out of the feed store then, Ethan first and Lydia behind him, and they stood on the steps in the afternoon sun and blinked like people coming out of a room that had been too close and too warm. Lydia looked up at the sky. She looked at the street. She looked at Clara. Can we go home? She asked. Her voice was still rough, but clearer than it had been in the feed store, like something was slowly working itself loose. Mercer turned toward her. His expression, which had been carefully managed all day, did something complicated and unguarded when he heard her voice. He crouched down in the street, the same movement he'd made in the mud outside Clara's cabin, in the rain 2 nights ago, and looked at her. Not that house, he said. Not yet. We're going to find somewhere better first. Miss Clara's house? Lydia said. Clara looked at the girl. Lydia was looking back at her with the same dark, steady eyes, asking a perfectly practical question about where they were going to sleep, and also somehow asking something larger than that. For a while, Clara said. Yes. Lydia nodded. She reached up and took Ethan's hand, and then, with a deliberateness that felt different from the automatic reach for her brother, she reached out with her other hand and took Clara's. Clara held it. It was small and slightly cold and gripped with a surprising firmness. They walked down the street toward the horses, the 4 of them, not in a line and not in a formation, but in the loose and slightly awkward arrangement of people who are figuring out how to move together without having agreed to it in advance. Eleanor left Harrow's Creek 2 days later. She did not make a scene about it, which Clara had half expected and had in some ways been braced for. She simply went. Her trunks were loaded onto a wagon, and her driver took her south toward the county seat, and the Mercer house was emptied of her presence the way a room empties when a draft finds the window it was coming from, and the window is finally closed. Mercer had told her she needed to go. He told her the morning after the hearing at the house, with the foreman present as a witness. Clara knew this because Mercer told her about it that evening. He'd gone alone, which she'd thought about asking him not to do, and had decided not to, because the conversation that needed to happen between Caleb Mercer and Eleanor Mercer was not one that required anyone else in the room. Some things you have to do without a witness, not because you're hiding anything, but because you need to do them in your own voice without anyone else's presence shaping it. He said Eleanor had listened. She had not agreed exactly, and she had not conceded anything in so many words. But she had understood that the accounting was over and that the balance was not in her favor, and she was too practical a woman to spend energy fighting a position that had already been legally recorded against her. She left. It was not justice, not the complete and settled kind, because the county investigation was still pending, and its outcome was uncertain, and Eleanor Mercer had resources and connections that did not simply dissolve because a circuit judge had made unfavorable findings. But she was gone from the house, and gone from the children's daily existence, and in the immediate term, that mattered. Clara went back to teaching. The first morning, she walked into the schoolhouse at her usual time and found 8 children already seated, which was 2 more than her usual attendance. She taught her morning lesson on arithmetic and her afternoon lesson on reading. Standard lessons, the same ones she'd been teaching all spring. And when the day was done, she walked home and sat at her table and wrote the letter to her sister in Cincinnati that she'd been failing to write for a month. She wrote, "Dear Margaret, I hope this finds you well. Things here have been eventful. I am all right. I'll write the longer version when I have more time to sit with it." She sent it. It wasn't the long version, but it was true. Ethan started attending her school the following week. He was already ahead of the other children his age in reading. He had been teaching himself from whatever books he could find in the Mercer house, which was, Clara thought, the most clarifying piece of information she had learned about him. And she put him in with the older group and watched him absorb things with the same focused, unshowy attention he brought to everything. He didn't try to impress anyone. He just learned. Lydia came to the schoolhouse with him most days because she was too young for formal lessons, but Mercer didn't want her at the house without people she trusted, and Clara set up a corner of the room with a blanket and some picture books and let the girl sit there. Lydia mostly observed. She watched the lessons without joining them, and she talked sometimes, not constantly, not easily, but in specific moments when something moved her enough to say it. She said words the way you use a new tool when you're still learning how much force it requires. Carefully, testing the weight. The sparrow, Clara thought, watching from a distance, waiting to decide. 3 weeks after the hearing, the county sheriff came through Harrow's Creek and conducted formal interviews regarding Eleanor's treatment of the children. He was a more capable man than Clara had expected. Methodical, unhurried, not easily diverted. He spoke to Greer and to Ethan and to 2 other employees of the Mercer property who had apparently been waiting for an official reason to say what they'd seen. He took his notes and he went back to the county seat, and the formal investigation proceeded in the slow, grinding way of formal things. It would be 2 more months before Eleanor Mercer was charged with criminal neglect, the minimum charge that the evidence supported, which was not everything and was not nothing. She entered into a legal agreement that restricted her movements and her authority. She did not return to Harrow's Creek. Mercer spent those weeks rebuilding. It was not a graceful process. He hired a new housekeeper, a stout widow named Mrs. Baird, who had opinions about everything and communicated them freely, and who, Clara thought, was probably exactly right for the situation. He made decisions about the property that he had been deferring for years, and he made some of them badly, because he was a man learning to trust his own judgment after a long period of outsourcing it, and that process has a learning curve that doesn't care about urgency. He came to the cabin some evenings. Not every evening, not in a pattern that announced itself. He came when he had something to discuss or a problem he was turning over, and he and Clara sat at her table and talked, and sometimes it was about the children, and sometimes it was about the property, and sometimes it was about neither. Just the kind of conversation that happens when 2 people discover they can talk to each other without managing each other. He was not easy company. He had silences that went longer than comfortable, and opinions he held with more certainty than the evidence always warranted, and a habit of assuming things were resolved when they had only been decided. She told him so, when it was relevant. He received it without argument, which surprised her, and then sometimes did the same thing again the following week, which didn't. He was not trying to be easy. That was what she found herself returning to. He was trying to be honest, which was a different thing, and in some ways harder. One evening in late summer, she came back from the schoolhouse to find him at her porch with the children and a bucket of blackberries that Ethan had apparently picked along the creek path, and Lydia was sitting on the top step, eating them directly from the bucket with a focus that suggested she had given the question of sharing serious consideration and decided against it. "She ate half of them already," Ethan said, in the tone of someone who has accepted an injustice but wants it on the record. "You were slow," Lydia said, not looking up. Ethan stared at her. "You didn't even tell me you were going to start." "You were slow," she said again. Clara stopped on the path and looked at this scene, the full bucket going gradually empty, Ethan's aggrieved expression, Lydia's complete self-possession. Mercer leaning against the porch rail, watching the 2 of them with an expression on his face that she had not seen there before. It was not exactly happiness, because happiness is too simple a word for what it was. It was more like a man recognizing something he had thought was lost, and finding that the recognition itself is almost more than he can hold. He looked up and saw Clara watching. She didn't say anything, neither did he for a moment. "There's still some left," he said finally, "if you want any." "You should probably eat them before Lydia finishes," Clara said. Lydia looked up from the bucket at the sound of her name, caught Clara's eye, and then, with the absolutely unself-conscious directness of a 4-year-old, held out 3 blackberries in her palm. Clara took them. They were warm from the afternoon and very sweet. She sat down on the porch step. Ethan sat beside her and launched into a detailed account of where the best blackberries were and why, which was both more information than anyone had asked for and entirely welcome. Lydia returned to the bucket. Mercer sat on the rail and listened to his nephew describe berry-picking strategy with the same attention he gave to everything, and the evening came in slow and golden over the creek, and the sparrow, or sparrow, Clara could not be certain it was the same one, landed in the yard and hopped through the grass looking for whatever it was looking for. It was not a perfect evening. Clara's back ached from standing all day. Ethan's account of the berry picking had moved into a tangent about a rabbit he'd seen that had very little relevance to anything but that he clearly needed to tell someone. Mercer had a tension in his shoulders that had not entirely gone away and probably wouldn't for a while yet, because men who have spent years not dealing with things do not stop carrying them just because the immediate crisis is resolved. It was not perfect, and Clara sat in it anyway, with her 3 blackberries eaten and the evening coming in and the particular warmth of a child's shoulder pressed against her arm. And she thought that imperfect was maybe what she should have been looking for all along. The blackberry evening was not a turning point so much as a marker, the kind of moment you don't recognize as significant while you're in it, only later, when you look back and try to trace the line of how things changed. What actually changed them was slower and less picturesque than a single evening on a porch. It was the accumulation of ordinary days, each one slightly less difficult than the one before, wearing down the sharp edges of what had happened the way water wears down stone, not dramatically, not all at once, but persistently, until one morning you reach for the thing that used to hurt and find that its shape has changed in your hand. Autumn came to Harrow's Creek the way it always did, without announcement, the light shifting from summer's flat directness to something more slanted and amber, the creek running lower, the mornings arriving cold and then warming into something almost pleasant by midday. Clara's schoolhouse filled in the fall the way frontier schoolhouses always did. Children who'd spent summer helping with harvests and livestock, returning to their desks with the particular restlessness of young people who have been useful and are not sure how to go back to sitting still. She managed them the way she always had, with a combination of patience and a firmness that didn't perform itself. And if her mind wandered sometimes to the Mercer property and the 2 particular students she had there, she kept that to herself and did her job. Ethan continued to come to the schoolhouse on the days Mercer didn't need him, which was most days, because Mercer was deliberate about not letting the boy be useful in ways that cost him his education. He was advancing faster than Clara had a curriculum for, which was a problem she found she didn't mind having. She ordered 2 books from Cincinnati through her sister, a geography primer and a collection of natural history essays, and watched him consume them with the same hungry focus he brought to everything. Lydia came with him most mornings and sat in her corner with her picture books and her careful observations, and she talked more now, not constantly, not without effort, but with increasing willingness, as if she were testing the weight-bearing capacity of words one sentence at a time and finding that they held. She had opinions. Clara discovered this gradually, about which stories were worth reading and which were boring, about the sparrow in the yard that she had named without telling anyone, and then one day referred to by name as if everyone already knew it, about the arithmetic lessons that Ethan was doing and that she watched from her corner with an attention that suggested she was doing them in her head without telling anyone that either. She's going to be ahead of her age group, Clara told Mercer one evening in October. She's been doing Ethan's sums. He looked at her. How do you know? Because she corrected him last week, out loud. She didn't mean to. She just said the answer before she thought about whether she was going to, and then she looked like she'd surprised herself. Mercer was quiet for a moment. He had the expression he got when something moved him, and he was deciding how much of that to let show, which was a process she had become familiar with. What did Ethan do? Argued with her for 30 seconds, then checked her answer, then didn't say anything, which for Ethan is basically a concession speech. Mercer almost smiled. It got most of the way there. This was how the autumn passed, in increments, in small accumulations, in the slow work of rebuilding something that had been broken before anyone thought to notice it was breaking. Mrs. Baird ran the house with the efficiency of a woman who has managed difficult situations before and does not require gratitude for it, only reasonable working conditions. The property functions resumed under Greer's management, more orderly now that there wasn't an opposing current of household authority running against every decision. The children slept in proper rooms with doors that opened from the inside. These were not extraordinary things. They should not have been extraordinary things. That they felt like a kind of miracle was itself a comment on how low the bar had been. The county proceedings moved forward with the slowness that characterized all formal legal matters in that territory. Eleanor's criminal neglect charge remained active. Her solicitor filed 2 motions that were denied. The county circuit reviewed Hale's findings and affirmed them in full, which Mercer told Clara about on a Tuesday morning in November, standing at her door with his hat in his hands, and she received the news with a feeling that was not triumph. Triumph was too simple for it, but something closer to relief at a debt being formally acknowledged. "It doesn't undo anything," he said. "No," Claire agreed, "but it's in the record, permanently. She'll appeal. Probably. But the record exists regardless of the appeal." Clara looked at him. "That was always the point." He nodded. He stood in her doorway for a moment longer than the news required, which she noticed. She had been noticing things about him for months now, with the particular involuntary attention of someone who has tried to be objective about a person and found that objectivity has its limits. "Is there something else?" she asked. "Not today," he said, and put his hat back on and left. She stood at the window after he'd gone and looked at the yard and thought about what that meant. Not today, and then decided she was going to stop thinking about it and go grade her students' reading work, which she did, mostly. The first snow came in late November. It came overnight and covered everything in the soft, muffling way that first snows do, before the cold has properly arrived and made the ground hard. So it lay thick and wet, and the world outside Claire's window looked like a version of itself that hadn't been worn in yet. Lydia saw it from the schoolhouse window during the morning session and made a sound, not a word, just a sound, that was so transparently delighted that 3 of the older boys laughed. And then Lydia looked at them with an expression so composedly dignified for a 4-year-old that they stopped laughing immediately, which Clara thought was one of the funniest things she had witnessed all year. After the morning session, she let them all out early. It seemed wrong to keep children inside on the first snow of the year, and she had never pretended to be above making decisions that didn't survive strict pedagogical scrutiny. Ethan built something in the yard that he claimed was a fort, and that looked more like a low wall that kept collapsing on one end. Lydia stood in the middle of the yard with her face tilted up and her eyes closed and her mouth open, which was either an attempt to catch snowflakes or something else entirely, and Clara watched from the porch and did not ask. Mercer arrived around noon, having ridden from the property for reasons he said involved a question about the eastern fence line, but that Clara suspected involved the snow and the children, because the question about the eastern fence line turned out to be answerable in 30 seconds. And then he stood on the porch with her for the next hour watching Ethan's fort fail and succeed and fail again. "He's going to be frustrated in a minute," Mercer said. "He already is," Clara said. "Watch his hands." Mercer watched. Ethan's movements had gotten slightly faster and slightly less precise, which was his frustration tell. He sped up when he was losing patience, which was exactly the wrong response to unstable snow construction and which he had not yet figured out. "Should we?" Mercer started. "Wait," Clara said. They waited. Ethan stood back from the collapsed wall. He stood there for a moment breathing, and then he looked at it, and then he started again, slower this time, packing the snow more carefully, testing the base before building on it. "There," Clara said. Mercer was quiet. Then, "You do that a lot." "Do what?" "Wait for them to figure it out instead of fixing it for them." "That's what teaching is," Clara said. "Mostly." "I didn't do that," he said. "With them. I fixed the immediate thing and left." She looked at him. He was watching Ethan, not her, but the words hadn't been directed at Ethan. "You're doing it now," she said. "Trying to." He exhaled. It made a small cloud in the cold air. "It's harder than it looks." "Most things are." They stood in the cold and watched the children in the snow, and Lydia opened her eyes eventually and looked at her brother's improving wall, and walked over and placed one very deliberate snowball on top of it as a kind of architectural commentary, and Ethan looked at it and then at his sister, and then decided, apparently, that it was an improvement. Clara thought about the first night, the door in the storm, the small cold hand holding the lantern light. She thought about how she had stood there with a musket she barely knew how to fire, making a decision that she had understood, even in the moment, was going to cost her something. She had not known then what it was going to give her. You never do with those kinds of decisions. That's what makes them hard. Winter deepened. Christmas came and went. The children received gifts that Mercer had ordered from the catalog, a set of wooden building blocks for Lydia, a proper bound notebook, and a good pen for Ethan, who had been writing in whatever margins and scraps of paper he could find. Clara gave Ethan 3 more books and gave Lydia a small carved sparrow that she'd asked a man in town who did woodwork to make, and Lydia held it in both hands and looked at it for a long time, and then looked at Clara and said, "It's exactly right," with a solemnity that was both very funny and entirely serious. January brought a cold that settled in and didn't move for 3 weeks. Clara's mornings became about keeping the schoolhouse warm enough to teach in, and her evenings became about staying close to her own fire and reading and not thinking too hard about anything. She wrote to her sister more regularly now. Proper letters, longer ones, the kind she'd been avoiding for years. She told Margaret about the children, about Ethan's progress in natural history, about Lydia's architectural opinions, and about Mercer, whom she described as a neighbor who has become a consistent presence, which she knew her sister would read correctly and which she couldn't yet say more plainly even to herself. Margaret wrote back, "You sound different, lighter somehow. That cabin of yours sounds less lonely than it used to." Clara read this letter twice and put it away and went to teach her students and tried to decide whether her sister was right, and concluded, reluctantly, that she was. The thing about loneliness is that you don't always know you're in it. You tell yourself you chose this, and that's true, and you tell yourself you're content, and that's partially true. And you build a life out of those partial truths. And it's a good life, a real life, a life with work in it that matters. But there is a difference. Clara was learning this slowly, the way adults learn things that younger people absorb without effort, between a life that is sufficient and a life that is full. And the difference is not always visible from the inside. She had been sufficient. She was, gradually, becoming something else. Go. Mercer asked her to come to the property in early March. He said he wanted to show her something, which was exactly the kind of vague invitation that she had learned to take at face value with him, because he was not a man who said things he didn't mean, and also not a man who said more than he meant. She rode out on a Saturday morning when there were no classes, following the familiar track to the property that she had ridden more times in the past 6 months than in the previous 4 years combined. The property looked different in the thin early spring light than it had when she'd last seen it in winter. Something had been repaired on the east side of the main house. She could see the new lumber, pale against the older wood. The yard had been cleared, and there was a kitchen garden being started along the south wall, the soil turned over in neat rows. Mrs. Baird was visible through the kitchen window. The children were not immediately visible, which Clara noted before she noted most other things, and then she heard Lydia's voice from somewhere around the back of the house. Not the words, just the voice, talking to someone with the steady, unhurried rhythm she had when she was explaining something she considered important. Mercer came out to meet her. He looked like a man who had slept properly for a few months in a row, which was a different thing from the man who had come to her door in the midnight rain. He still carried his silences too long sometimes, and he still held opinions with more certainty than they always warranted, and he was still learning what it meant to stay instead of manage from a distance. And all of that was visible in him in the way that people's ongoing work is visible if you've been paying attention long enough. "The children are around back," he said. "Greer is showing them how to turn the soil." "Lydia's explaining something," Clara said. "She's been explaining to Greer how a garden should be organized," Mercer said. "She saw a picture of a formal garden in one of the books you lent, and she has strong opinions." "Greer's listening?" "He's been listening for 20 minutes. He told me afterward that she's probably right about the drainage." Clara took this in. Then she said, "You said you wanted to show me something." "Yes." He looked at her for a moment. He did the thing he did sometimes where he seemed to be selecting words from a larger set and setting aside the ones that weren't right. "Come inside." She followed him in. Mrs. Baird acknowledged her arrival with a nod that was also somehow an assessment and moved to the far end of the kitchen, because Mrs. Baird was a woman who understood when a room needed fewer people in it. Mercer took her to the front parlor, which had been the room that felt most like Eleanor's when Clara had last been here. Formal furniture, a writing desk, the specific impersonal order of a space maintained for appearance rather than use. It had been changed. The formal furniture was still there but pushed differently, and there was a low table near the window with paper on it and what appeared to be Ethan's notebook in progress, and a small cushion on the window seat that had clearly been Lydia's position for some time based on the dent in it. "This is their room now," Mercer said. "Study room. Whatever they need it to be." Clara looked at the paper on the table. Ethan had been working on something. Natural history notes, she could tell from the format. with an attempt at a diagram that was ambitious and not quite accurate, and entirely characteristic of a boy who is reaching past what he can currently do because he needs to know if he can get there. "He's going to need someone more advanced than me soon," Clara said. "I wrote to a school in Indianapolis," Mercer said. "There's a proper natural history program. They accept students at 12 with demonstrated proficiency." He paused. "That's 5 years. But I wanted to know it was there." She looked at him. He was looking at the table, at the notebook. "You've been planning," she said. "I've been trying to." He looked up. "I've been trying to think past the immediate problem. That's new for me." "I know," she said. He was quiet. She waited because she had learned that his silences were not gaps to be filled, but spaces he needed to move through at his own pace. "I want to ask you something," he said. "All right. I want to ask it plainly because I have a tendency to manage things from a distance and say less than I mean, and then be surprised when the result is that no one knows what I meant, and I'm trying not to do that." He said this not as a preamble, but as a genuine accounting of his own failures, stated so directly that it arrived without decoration. "So I'm going to say exactly what I mean." "Please," Clara said. He looked at her. He did not look away, which she had noticed was something he did when he was being most honest. He stopped performing anything and just looked at you, and the looking itself was a kind of statement. "I would like you to be here," he said, "not as the children's teacher, not as a neighbor. I would like you to be here as I would like to build something with you. I don't mean it as a practical arrangement. I mean it the way you mean something when it has been true for longer than you've let yourself say it." The room was quiet. Outside, she could hear Lydia's voice drifting around from the back of the house, still explaining the drainage situation to Greer. Clara looked at Caleb Mercer, at the new lumber visible through the window behind him, at the dent in the window cushion, at the notebook on the table, at this man who had taken far too long to see what was happening in his own house, and had then spent 6 months not making excuses for that and not pretending it was less than it was, which was the hardest thing she had seen anyone do in a long time. He was not a simple man, and he was not a finished man, and he was not offering her something easy. "I know this comes with complications," he said. "I know that what I'm asking you to consider includes 2 children who are going to be a great deal of work for a long time. I know that your position here, your independence, the life you've built, I'm not asking you to give any of that up. I'm asking—" He stopped. "I'm asking if there's room for something more than what we have now." Clara thought about the letter to her sister. Lighter, somehow. Less lonely. She thought about Lydia handing her 3 blackberries in the summer evening, that small, deliberate gesture that was both very simple and the most direct declaration a 4-year-old knows how to make. She thought about Ethan at her porch step that first morning, not asking to be saved, but asking to be seen. She thought about herself at 31, sitting at her table with a cold cup of tea and the first line of a letter she couldn't finish, before any of this, in the life she had told herself she'd chosen. She had chosen it. That was still true, but people are allowed to choose again. "I have conditions," she said. Something shifted in his face. Not relief. He was too careful for relief yet. But an opening, like a door that hasn't swung wide but has moved off its latch. "Tell me," he said. "I keep teaching," she said. That's not negotiable. That work is mine and it matters, and I'm not giving it up because I'm someone's wife." "I wouldn't ask you to." "I know you wouldn't ask," she said. "I'm saying it so it's said clearly, so we both know it was said." He nodded. He understood the difference. She had seen him learn it over the past 6 months. The difference between the thing no one asked and the thing that gets explicitly agreed to. "The children make their own choices as they get older," she said. "About the school in Indianapolis, about whatever comes after that. We give them the options and we let them decide. We don't plan their lives at them." "Agreed." "And if something in this house isn't working," she said, "we say so, directly. We don't manage each other from a distance and hope the other person figures out what we meant." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That one I'll probably need help with." "I know," Clara said. "That's why I'm saying it now, so when it happens, I can say I told you and you can agree that you were warned." He looked at her. The thing that had been almost a smile on the porch in the snow was fully present now. which changed his face considerably and made her understand that she had been seeing the edited version of him for months. "Is that yes?" he asked. "That's yes," Clara said, "with conditions." "I'll take it," he said. "He came." They married in May, when the mud had dried and the wildflowers had come up along the creek bank, and the territory was in the brief extravagant period between mud season and the heat of summer when everything is green and nothing has died back yet. The ceremony was simple. Harlan Gibbs officiated, which was an irony that Clara appreciated more than she showed, and attended by the people who had come to matter, Greer and his wife, Mrs. Baird looking approving in the specific way she did everything, a dozen families from the settlement whose children Clara had taught, and Clara's sister Margaret, who had ridden out from Cincinnati for the occasion, and who stood beside Clara in the morning light and held her hand and didn't say anything, because some things are better said in letters. Ethan stood very straight in a new suit that he had grown into slightly faster than expected, which meant the sleeves were a little short, which he had noticed and accepted with the philosophical pragmatism of a boy who has learned to distinguish important problems from unimportant ones. Lydia stood beside him in a blue dress, her choice. She had been shown several colors and pointed at blue without hesitation, and held the small carved sparrow in one hand because she had wanted to have it with her, and no one had found a reason to say no. It was not a grand occasion. The food was good, but not elaborate, and the weather was warmer than ideal, and Harlan Gibbs mispronounced Mercer's first name once, which everyone pretended not to notice. There were moments of awkward silence and moments of overlapping conversation, and at one point Ethan spilled cider on his new suit and looked so genuinely unconcerned about it that Clara realized he had arrived quietly and without announcement, at the kind of ease that means a person knows where they belong. Lydia came to find Clara late in the afternoon, when the gathering was winding down and the light was going gold over the creek. She found her standing at the edge of the yard, alone for a moment, and came and stood beside her and looked out at the same thing Clara was looking at, which was nothing in particular, just the creek, just the light. "Are you happy?" Lydia asked. She had the directness of a child who has decided that questions are more useful than assumptions. Clara looked down at her. She thought about how to answer this honestly, which was the only way she knew how to answer Lydia, because Lydia always knew. "Yes," she said. "I am. Are you?" Lydia considered this with the seriousness she brought to important questions. "Mostly," she said. "Sometimes I still think about before." "That's all right," Clara said. "Thinking about before doesn't mean you're not happy now. They can both be true at the same time." Lydia looked at her. "Like how you were sad when Mama died and also happy when we learned to ride the horses." "Exactly like that," Clara said. She had not known about the horse riding. She filed it away. Lydia reached up and took her hand. Her grip was warmer and more certain than the first time she'd reached for Clara's hand outside the feed store, which had itself been warmer and more certain than the dark, stormy night when she'd hidden her face in her brother's neck and not looked at anyone. She was changing the way children change, not in straight lines, not smoothly, but visibly, accumulation by accumulation, each small thing building on the last. "Ethan says you're our family now," Lydia said. "Not just Miss Clara." "What do you think?" Clara asked. Lydia looked at the creek for a moment. The sparrow, or a sparrow, was down there somewhere. She had seen it earlier. She was probably thinking about where it had gone. "I think yes," she said, and went back to find her brother, still holding the carved bird. Years passed in the way that years pass when you are living in them rather than waiting for them. Not quickly, not slowly, but with the specific texture of days that have weather and meals and arguments and small triumphs and children growing out of their shoes and the ordinary accumulation of a life that has chosen itself. Ethan went to Indianapolis at 12, as planned. He came back for summers and holidays and wrote letters that were increasingly long and technical and that Clara read carefully and Mercer read with a dictionary. He came back changed each time, the way young people come back changed when the world is confirming rather than diminishing what they already knew about themselves. More certain, more articulate, more fully Ethan in ways that made the younger version of him visible by contrast. He studied natural history. He became eventually a man who wrote papers and gave lectures and argued with other men who wrote papers and gave lectures. and he retained throughout all of it the habit of paying attention that he had developed in the Mercer house as a matter of survival and carried forward into the rest of his life as a matter of practice. He was not a simple man. He was not always easy. He was thoroughly, specifically himself, which is the best outcome a person can hope for. Lydia did not go to Indianapolis. She made this decision at 10 with the same clear deliberateness she brought to all her decisions, and when Clara asked her why, she said she wasn't done with what was here yet, which Clara found to be a complete and sufficient answer. She learned from Clara until she had exceeded what Clara could teach, and then she learned from books. And then at 16, she began teaching the younger children in the schoolhouse on the days Clara needed help. And she turned out to be extraordinary at it. Not because she was patient, which she wasn't, not particularly, but because she had an absolute intolerance for children being made to feel small, and that intolerance communicated itself to every room she was in. She did not talk about the cellar, not directly, not to anyone outside the family, but there were things she would not do. She would not lock a door she didn't have to lock. She would not send a child away to be alone with something that frightened them. She would not tell a person that what they felt was a manipulation. These were not rules she stated. They were just how she was, built from what had happened to her in the same way that everything in a person is built from what has happened to them, the bad and the good, reshaped into the material of who you become. She named the sparrow, for the record, Edmund. When Clara pointed out that the sparrow who visited their yard was almost certainly not the same sparrow across 8 years, Lydia said she was aware of that, and the name applied to the sparrow as a category rather than a specific individual, and Clara conceded the point because it was actually a defensible position. Clara taught until she was 53, when the school had grown enough to require 3 teachers, and she had trained 2 of them herself and decided that was a good place to stop. She did not stop working. She wrote curriculum guides that were used by schools across 3 counties, and she consulted for 2 new schoolhouses that were being built in the expanding territory. And she argued with the county school board about teacher pay for the rest of her life with mixed but non-zero success. Mercer built the property and made mistakes and rebuilt around the mistakes and got better at staying. That was the core of it for him, learning that being present was not a passive state, that it required the same kind of active, ongoing decision that any other work required. He had years when he managed it well, and years when old habits reasserted themselves, and Clara told him so, directly, as she had said she would, and he received it without argument and tried again, as he had always done. He was not a finished man. Neither was she. That was not the point of it. The point of it, you had to say, if someone asked you to identify what the whole thing had been about, what the storm and the door and the musket and the mud and the letters and the feed store and the blackberries and the snow and the March morning in the parlor had all been building toward, the point of it was not the happy ending, because happy endings are descriptions of moments. And this was a life, which is to say it was ongoing and imperfect and full of days that didn't resolve cleanly. The point of it, Clara thought sometimes, was the door, not the metaphor of it. The actual door. The decision to open it on a night when every cautious and self-preserving instinct she had told her to stay inside, when opening it was going to cost her something she couldn't fully calculate yet, when she had no guarantee that what was on the other side of it deserved what she was about to give. She had opened it anyway, and what she had found on the other side was not safety or simplicity or any of the things that cautious people protect themselves in hopes of finding. What she had found was a boy holding his sister in a storm, asking not to be saved but to be seen, and the rest of it, the family, the years, the life that filled the cabin's emptiness and then outgrew the cabin entirely, all of that had come from the single act of deciding that what was outside her door mattered more than what it was going to cost her. There are people who go their whole lives measuring that calculation, who stand at the door and weigh the risk against the return and conclude that the math doesn't justify the exposure. And sometimes they're right. Sometimes the thing on the other side of the door is exactly as dangerous as it appears, and caution is wisdom, and staying inside is the correct choice. But sometimes, not always, not even most of the time, but sometimes, the thing on the other side of the door is 2 children who needed someone to choose them. And in those moments, the person who opens the door doesn't just change the children's life. They change their own. They find out what they were capable of when they stopped calculating and just acted, and they carry that knowledge forward into everything else, and it makes them different, larger somehow, more themselves. Clara Winslow opened her door in a storm in 1818 with a musket she barely knew how to fire and a life she had convinced herself was sufficient. What came through that door changed everything she thought she knew about what sufficient meant. She never regretted it, not once, not even on the hard days, not even in the years when the work was slow and the outcomes were uncertain and the weight of other people's lives pressed against her own in ways that were not always comfortable. She carried it all, the weight and the work and the love that is not separate from those things but made of them. And she found, as she grew older, that it had not diminished her. It had been, from beginning to end, exactly enough.